Thank you, that's up. So, hi everybody, I'm Alex. Just to warn everybody, this is the first time I've gone through both this content with these screenshots, so fingers crossed we do well. So what we're really talking about is building prototypes and very early concepts of ideas very, very quickly with front-end frameworks. Just a quick show of hands, because I really didn't know who'd be here today. Who's actually a programmer? Sweet, so we can get moderately technical. And everybody else, I assume, is just product marketing, stuff like that. Hello, waving person. Great, so I'm partner in Isle of Code, just to go for 10 seconds very, very quickly. We're a much smaller team in Toronto where everybody's basically been running technology at a company that raised money and did pretty well before. We really focus on prototyping, building a mobile app in Ember, making it work on iOS, Android, using Canvas to make it feel completely native. We've been doing a lot of canvas and lately a lot of beacon work, which has become a specialty but was never really targeted. It seems people in Toronto like beacons a lot. So what we're going through today is just maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes on our philosophy of prototyping, how we approach it, what we look for when we're building a prototype. And then for most of this talk, we're actually going to go through an idea we had, what it looked like in iteration 1, all the way to basically where we are today, which is beta, and how we made the decisions to get there. So just very quickly to set context as well, as I said in the introduction, we do this with Ember. No need to get into spiritual wars. We like React as well. We mostly like Angular sometimes. Doesn't really matter which one you use though. So why do we prototype? Everybody here I assume has built prototypes before? Mostly? Sweet. So the first or main reason is we want to test and iterate on ideas cheaply. We'll get into why we believe a prototype is better than that from pen and paper a little bit later. But the main reason is we want to throw a lot of stuff at the wall and try and decide what we think will be best. We want to align teams around very, very simple ideas. So we do a lot of apps, right? At least a couple every month. One of the biggest problems we have is that half the people just don't understand what we're talking about, or they don't understand what their own company is building. We really want to have something very, very early so we can put it in front of everybody and have them know what we're talking about. Obviously, when you have a prototype, you go take it to customers, try and get them to buy things. This actually seems very revolutionary to a lot of our customers. To us, that is baffling, but I kind of want to take it out. And you want to expose product weaknesses before doing a long build. So one of the other nice things about working with technology and actually building a technology prototype versus a PSD or a wireframe is that you actually discover things that wouldn't work that you wouldn't have anticipated. Again, we'll get into some examples as we go through Unread. And most importantly, all of this just usually leads to a lot of very small tweaks in what you're building. That's very, very important because so much of your app is actually going to be experiential, right? That anybody can build an app, anybody can put a model on a screen. It really matters whether you did that well and how it feels to the user. A lot of those small tweaks end up being very, very important, especially when you made 10 of them and 20 of them that compounds very, very, very quickly. And exposing budget issues, we'll skip that. And speed final development. So again, when you go to your actual developers, you want to get the real version made. Again, we'll get into how we do that in a second. You want to do that as quickly as possible. And as a dev myself, if you send me a bunch of wireframes and a very big long scope document and some Excel sheets, really not that happy. Don't really know what you mean, and probably point out contradictions within that. So if you have something that you can show the dev that actually works, much easier for us to understand what you're asking for. So when we prototype, we're really doing it because we want to discover a few things up front. What's interesting, has anybody here heard of blind entrepreneur syndrome before? Some? So there's this interesting problem in startups, which is that a founder will basically not even consider whether what they're doing is right or wrong. They'll bury their head in the sand and just trust that their idea is the best idea, and the minute they finish it, it will be amazing. And that's actually contradictory to what you want to do. If your idea is bad, you want to discover that really, really fast, and have as much of a window as possible to go and change that and make it a little bit better, discover what you could do. So the first one is that the product doesn't work as theorized. We've been through this a lot. We've had some amazing wireframes. We've had some beautiful looking PSDs that look like they do everything we need them to do. The minute we move it to technology, it doesn't feel very good. You can't fill out the form, users didn't adopt it, etc. So we want to find that out really, really soon. If we can find that out within the first couple of days or the first week versus week 6 or 12 or 14, again, we're very, very happy because now we have all of that extra time to do something about it. Stakeholders don't have the perceived interest, so this is also a very interesting one. A lot of the time people will tell you your idea is great. You show them a wireframe, they get really, really excited about it. You show them a PSD, they get even more excited. You go and show them the actual app, and they just don't give a fuck anymore. So it happens all the time. So we want to find that out very, very soon as well. And the minute you actually give them the app and ask them to install it, best tell them whether or not they actually care. We can go to 10 people, 9 of them tell us it's amazing. We ask them to install it, and maybe 1 does. That's a tell, and you should really read into that as quickly as you can. Technology solution is harder to achieve. So this is another interesting one. We're actually working on a project over the summer that I'm allowed to talk about. Basically, it was an app that would plug into people's Twitter feeds and understand when content should be posted based on content analysis, right? That right now, World Cup is trending. Here are some articles about soccer, these should be posted. So we've given these really, really beautiful wireframes that showed exactly how this would work. The function was understood, but it turns out it's actually very hard to semantically parse that content and understand that this article is about soccer or football and how these things are related. So again, by going straight to a prototype, we discovered this in a week and a half. If we actually went by the traditional process, we would have done a bunch of wireframes, gone and built the original mobile app, probably blown at least 100 or 200 grand before we discovered that, which nobody would have been very happy. Not enough data for testing, so this is actually a very good problem. And again, all of these problems are very good because if you know them very soon, you can do something about it. So not enough data, that content parsing is a very, very good idea. A lot of the time you go, you build something, and what a developer or a designer does is we insert mock data. We insert a mock name, we insert a mock profile for a user, whatever it is that we want to do. It's actually a really bad idea, and it's bad because it doesn't necessarily reflect how actual users will use your app and what data they'll type in. And so often we've had these, again, really nice designs. We've pointed out that maybe an entire name won't fit on a single line, and we need to go to 2 lines. Generally speaking, that destroys all of the beautiful spacing we just got given, and the design doesn't look good anymore. So let us go and make an ugly version with real data. We'll discover that very quickly. Interestingly, this one is, I think we've all encountered, technology is slower than imagination. Again, if we figure that out by week 1, we can actually have a real timeline and people won't be disappointed. And again, this relates back to the other point. Customers really like what they're doing. They've even downloaded the prototype. They're incredibly happy that they don't end up changing their behavior at the end of the day. I think this is what happens to 99 out of 100 startups. They build great technology. We're all very, very happy with it. A week later, we stop. So we want to discover that soon. Again, prototype by week 1 or 2 means you can do that. So now we're getting into fun stuff. That was just the generic prototypey talk. So in terms of frameworks, as I said, we use Ember. Doesn't really matter what you use, but you should use Ember because it's the best one. So our goal, really, when we're prototyping, and I was having this discussion with a few other people today, is that we're not actually trying to prototype the entire app. We're trying to figure out what is it that this app actually does that's different or special that we're promoting to people, and that's all we're interested in prototyping. You'll see this when we talk about Unread. The best example I can give you is totally ignore user registration, totally ignore user login, ignore sessions. Things like this are utilities. We know developers can do that. That's not what we're trying to build. It doesn't matter how quick your login form is. If your app sucks, people won't care. So interestingly, the reason we like the front-end framework is for these characteristics, which is what we were looking for a long time, especially coming from the Rails side, which I thought was really cool for the 1.5 years I was developing with Rails. Then I realized I could go even faster. So the first one is the distinction between back-end and front-end concerns. The easiest way I can explain this is for the non-programmers is that when you're staying in JavaScript and working within the browser, you're much more interested in how does a user transition in between pages and how we're going to slide that. What does that look like and feel like? A back-end concern is more, how do we validate that this user has permission to access that data? Being able to separate those very, very early means we're focused on what actually matters, which is how will a user use this app? What are they going to do? Very importantly, we like Ember data because it gives us the ability to mock an API response early. So when we're building a prototype, what we don't want is to go and put in all of this mock data and then realize that we have no way of getting the actual application when it's time to go to production. So is everybody here familiar with what an API is? Mostly? Sweet. So Ember has this amazing thing called fixtures. And what a fixture is you basically write a hash in your adapter file, and you can say that, I have 5 contacts that I'm stubbing and making available in the app. Here is what they look like. So it's no different to just injecting dummy data, but you're doing so programmatically. The reason this is very interesting is that when you're ready to go to production, maybe start using a live API, you can just change that adapter to a REST adapter, and we'll understand how to serialize those real models and which endpoint they should be taken from. So what's very nice here is that we can only spend about 5 minutes or 10 minutes and actually be using a live API from stub data without needing to change any construction of our app. The other really nice thing is because this is convention-driven, we're already forced into using RESTful resources and RESTful routes. This is very, very good. Probably about half the rescue projects they get, the reason they needed a rescue is because they didn't use RESTful conventions. So you want to get into that design very, very, very early. Components, so we like Ember components. The main reason we want that in a framework that we're playing around with and trying to prototype with is we're throwing code around. We're changing what the app does, we're changing what it feels like, we're changing login forms all the time. We don't want to have to deal with the fact that things will break. We want things to just keep working as we're building a better and better prototype. So if we have components, it means that they're all introverted, they don't really know what's going on around them anyway, so they're not going to break. We can keep thrashing this out and we'll be good. So as few dependencies as possible. This point's interesting because I have a bit of a hate-on relationship with NPM, which you have to use with Node. But when we say as few dependencies as possible, what we really mean is that we don't even need to deploy an API server yet. We don't even worry about a server. We just want to mock that core idea, and if we can just stay in JavaScript and just stay in a framework, we're pretty happy. As multi-platform as possible, so what's interesting about these content frameworks is that you can use CDF to make them work as native desktop applications. Obviously, you can use PhoneGap and Canvas to make them feel like completely native mobile applications. You can go and drop them as a website as well. What's interesting, I'll get into what we're talking about on Red, is that half the time we actually get scope to go and build a desktop application and a mobile application. And 2 days into the project, we realized that that's actually not the best fit, that this desktop app should have actually been a mobile app all along. So if you have that portability within your front-end code to decide, you know what, I'm just going to see what this looks like in a phone, and it's only going to take you 20 minutes, really, really good, because you want to be playing around with things as long as possible and as much as possible. Last point there, simply having a framework matters because convention matters. If you're not a convention person, sometimes it's interesting as a programmer to see how many are not convention-driven. Just consider that the conventions aren't for you. It's for when you're bringing in 3 programmers and 5 programmers and now 10 programmers, and we all need to figure out how the app's working. If you've come up with what you think is the best idea, even if it's better, none of us are educated in what you've done or why you've done it. Everybody gets confused, everybody gets unhappy. So now we're getting into fun stuff. So what I'm really going to talk through today is an app that we built and how we went from coming up with the idea to wireframing it to actually doing a prototype, which is the meat of the talk. So there are 3 main steps to doing a prototype. Obviously, ideation, I hate that word. I just couldn't figure out what was the right there. Doing a wireframe, and then doing a prototype. So, sweet, that's not the order I put them in, but we'll go this way. So what's interesting as well is when you're doing a prototype, there are 2 different types. And we distinguish this because it should change how you're approaching your build and what you're doing. And we generally distinguish between an idea where most of the stuff is known up front and an idea where very little is known up front. A good example of something where most of it is known up front is an internal tool. We know who the user is, we know exactly what we need to get back, we know what data we need to pull. Very, very happy, you can almost wireframe the thing and just go straight to a build. We work with a lot of startups and with a lot of net new ideas and net new tech that maybe hasn't been played around with a lot. And in that case, we actually don't even know what we're building yet. We have a foggy idea of what that core feature should be, but we know nothing else. And we like distinguishing those builds because when the idea is known, you honestly can go from a single wireframe straight to the build, everybody's happy. When you're working on an idea that's much less known, you kind of want to do as many prototype iterations as you can, and you want to focus on low fidelity versus high fidelity wireframes. Reason being that we're not even up to design yet because we don't know what we're designing. We don't even know what we're building yet. And interestingly here, as I was saying, the first iteration on Red, we actually thought it was going to be a desktop app. Only later did we realize that what we're making was a mobile application. So from the idea side, and if you want to play around with Unread, feel free to send me an email. It will be at the end of the presentation as well. We're starting to put more and more people into this little app that we've been playing around with. What we wanted to do was build an app that would plug into our Gmail accounts and basically just make a list of everybody that I forgot to respond to in the last week because I'm really, really bad at that. And also to make a list of how many people it's been for the last 90 days, who we haven't spoken to for more than 90 days, basically. And you can imagine this is very helpful as somebody who runs a smaller contracting firm, basically. Somebody we haven't spoken to for 90 days we probably want to get back in touch with. So that was the idea we had, and that's all we had. We hadn't built anything, we hadn't done any wireframes, this didn't evolve from somewhere else. Interestingly as well, what we didn't have to worry about was the back-end email parsing because I've been messing around with email tech for a while. We already knew that bit was achievable. We knew that we could go and build a backend that plugged into Gmail and sucked down everybody's stuff. We knew that there was an API for that and we could get access permissions for that. So we weren't too worried about going and seeing whether we could actually get into the data. Otherwise, that would be step one. Make sure you can actually access the data that you need. So the first step was lo-fi frames. That's very, very lo-fi as a frame. We didn't even do it with DAOSmec. But that's all we needed because we just wanted to figure out what is this main screen of an unread. So we do a lo-fi frame just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. You'd be amazed at just doing that 5-minute pen and paper sketch, how many people, especially who are not technical, now kind of understand what we're talking about. It's good to give that to developers as well, especially if you're not a developer, because it lets us start imagining how this needs to get built, what questions we need to ask. A lot of the time people explain their idea really well. By the time we get a wireframe, we realize that they forgot to talk about 3 features, and those 3 features just so happen to be the hardest and most expensive ones. So getting that done early is very, very good. Don't really need to do too much more than the frame you're seeing here. In fact, when people spend longer trying to make a lo-fi frame, we get a little bit angry at them. Because we're not trying to make it perfect yet, we're not even trying to get the buttons in the right order or know what buttons we need on the screen. We're just trying to make the definition a little bit foggy. So with Unread, what we realized is that we were trying to build a Tinder-like game that would go through all of our contacts and show us a single screen with a person's photo, when they last sent me an email, when I last received an email from them, and then I could, swipe them to the left, swipe them to the right if anybody's played Tinder, reject them to the left, happy to the right, hope they go right as well. And that's all we're really showing on this screen. That's all we needed. So we went straight into programming. And the reason we went straight into programming is because this was an idea that we otherwise didn't know much about. We just had a concept. And we realized that if we started messing around now, it would give us 2 things. We'd both get to start playing with the app. And when you're developing, whether it's you or whether you're bringing an external firm, the best way you can work with your devs is actually to keep inserting week-long breaks after every week or 2-week sprint. And the reason you want to do that is the longer that you've actually been playing with it, the more you're going to make very small discoveries. I'll talk about some of the discoveries we made. Sometimes those discoveries are very simple, like we actually need to animate in between these screens. A lot of the time they're a little bit more profound. You want to give yourself as much of a window as possible to figure these things out. To be honest, we weren't worried about too much else. We wanted to go in this iteration 1, do the main init, just type in ember init and actually have a repo, git commit, init, we're happy. We wanted to start the contact model with fixtures, which is what I was talking about earlier. Do that drag and drop interface. The 3 main actions, nothing else. We weren't worried about what it looked like. We weren't really worried about how a user would log in. We weren't even worried about how they'd get the data in the system yet. All of these were solved problems. That's not what we were trying to build. So if you want to talk about ugly, that's what the first iteration looked like. Less than a day of programming time so far, maybe an hour or 2. But this one's not a video. I have a few videos intertwined so you can see how it works. But you've logged into the app. Some of these screenshots are a little funny, by the way, because I took them in Chrome Inspector instead of in an iPhone, just because timing. But it goes in, it loads the first contact that happened to be me. You drag into the green box on the left, you drag into the green box on the right, takes the action, goes and loads the next contact. The reason they're big green boxes is because it was an early prototype. We didn't even know whether the drag and drop would work. So making the thing green, at least we know it would work. We could have put another 20 minutes in just to make sure that would be perfect, but again, we don't want to burn programming if we don't have to. Every chance that something like this would change. You also notice that we had this little idea of putting the buttons to the right. That becomes a little bit more profound later as we talk. So we had that first iteration, and again, not a lot of work went into it, but it was great. We both understood what we were building. Sweet. So then we wanted to plug in real data. And we wanted to plug in real data because this is an email system. We weren't really sure, both, is this a good idea from a data point of view? What are people's names going to look like? What is this even going to look like? Is it going to pull in a bunch of people who were spamming me? Is it mostly going to raise people we didn't care about? So we actually wanted to jack into real data and start getting live experiences. Depending on the type of project you're doing, you may want to stay in fixtures a little bit longer. That's kind of the TBD type of thing. What's interesting is that in iteration 1, we ended up dropping that drag and drop. So after 1 iteration, we realized that it was kind of a bad idea, that it required a lot of work on our user's behalf to actually make any action. And it's very slow, right? Taking this action, waiting for the next screen takes 2 to 3 seconds. And that's with perfect animations and everything that you want. That's still 2 to 3 seconds. And with the amount of data we were seeing, that was just not realistic. So we could have started making the app look good and work better, but we knew that there was a core problem with the way we wanted people to interact with it, which is so much more important than making it look or feel good right now. Live data also just stops us from cheating. When I say cheating, what I mean is it's, again, coming back to that line break example, it's the best one I can give you. We've seen too many cases where, oh shit, this design's going to new line, so I'm just going to make all names less than 80 characters. Really, really great for development. The longer you put that problem off, the worse things are going to be for everybody. Just don't worry about what it looks like. Just as a heads up though, when I was taking screenshots, I mocked it back into fake data just so you can't see my email patterns. Not for my benefit, but privacy-wise, people probably wouldn't be happy if I pulled my Gmail up on the screen. So what's interesting, I have to keep minimizing it because we can't play movies without minimizing back into QuickTime. This is what our second iteration looked like. So you notice that the drag and drop's gone because we realized that was a bad idea. We've got those three actions to the right that become a little bit bigger and taking over the screen. And there's now this new information of, when was the last time that person sent me an email? When was the last time that person received an email from me? This was the first time we'd integrated that data into the stack. Again, later you'll see that little idea that we started messing around with became very, very important to the end application. So just to show you, we also tied it up a little bit. So you can actually go through, press the button, and you'll see that it's navigating through next contact, next contact, next contact. You're probably noticing as well, not all those contacts have names. That's something else we discovered in this iteration, that the average contact in Gmail doesn't necessarily have a name for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they're spammers, sometimes they're just very, very old people who didn't know how to set it in Gmail, and everything in between. So we actually had to come up with a strategy to handle that as well, which was just dumping the email address in lieu of a name being available. So just another version of that iteration. So by the way, we're at about maybe a day and a half or 2 days of development time so far, and so much of this was plugging in the live data. So what you can see, we played around with what that contact screen looks like. For a little while, we were playing with full-on background photos. Again, don't worry about any of this from the design point of view. We're not trying to make it look good yet. We're just trying to get a feel for whether or not something is a good idea or not. We actually find designers really like it when we come in with content like this. So just to show you that working, ignore that double swipe, by the way. This is just because I was taking it in Chrome, so at the same time a touch event was being called, a click event was also happening, so double across. That little know new accounts, you probably notice a lot of pictures of pugs. We were using them in development just because it was better than having real people. So iteration 3. So if you consider where we are so far, we've gone and plugged in live data, we've built this really, really small prototype, and we've learned a little bit, right? We've learned that people don't always have names, we've learned that we don't like drag and drop, we've learned that pressing these buttons is so much better and so much faster. So we kind of wanted to pause for a bit, and as you're prototyping, you really want to iteratively build a more complete version of your app. So it was time to actually start making the app not fully complete, but still a little bit complete, because it was the first time things didn't feel right, but they felt close. That we were actually starting to use it ourselves instead of using it just because we built it, which is the biggest problem. So we wanted to start doing some things that we actually needed, such as actually having a nav bar, because up until that point, that nav user doesn't actually work most of the time. We wanted to start starting to get closer. We wanted to add user accounts because, believe it or not, up until this point, Aiden, who I'll point out as well in a second, we both plugged in our Gmail accounts and we were getting global data. I was seeing the stuff that he was emailing, he was seeing the stuff that I was emailing. So we just hadn't bothered to build any of that yet. So it was time to actually put that in now that we've greenlit that Lisa, this was something we wanted to keep doing. And interestingly, the ability to add multiple email accounts. You could argue that any of these we would have discovered by sitting down and doing 4 wireframes or 5 wireframes across a 2-week period, but we wouldn't have actually had the experiential understanding of how to slide around and what feels best from that point of view. What's interesting is that part of that experience was realizing that this entire concept of even dropping drag and drop, going to the Tinder style of showing the picture of the contact and just letting you go between them that way, wasn't very smart. It was a good idea that it didn't work in practice for the same reasons. Dropping the drag and drop made it a little bit faster, go from contact 1 to contact 2 to contact 3, but it was still really, really slow because you have to press the button and wait for it to animate out. In addition, what we were finding was twofold, that you sometimes had a bad experience because it would float people who you honestly didn't care about. And if we're in a Tinder game where you can only see one of them, if we do that 3 times, you're just going to close the app and not come back. So we wanted to start figuring out, well, how can we get around that problem? So interestingly, we discovered that let's just put that on an index. If anybody's used Gmail, that's basically an index view, right? We're just showing a list of everybody that's available. So we started messing around with that idea that maybe we should actually just list all of the contacts and give you this global view of who they are, and not default to that show screen or that contact screen, and show that screen as little as possible. What's interesting as well, this is about prototyping in front-end frameworks, and inevitably that also involves building some actual tech for the back-end framework. So at this point we also paused and just started messing around with our data structures. Up until this point, we were actually sucking the stuff from Rails, but not the best Rails code, really ugly SQL query. We'd never run it in production. I think there was a double each loop at one point that was filling a really big hash. But again, we were just trying to get stuff working, so we didn't really care. But we started playing around with graph databases for a little bit, realized that they're really cool, not the best solution to this problem, in part because I think graph databases are good when you have a big data set, when you're messing around less so, and it became another challenge, right? We have to worry about how we're going to keep the second database up, how we're going to monitor it. Just don't even deal with these problems yet. SQL will last a long time. If anybody's played before, you can really abuse the shit out of SQL before it will do anything. So technology you can abuse is a very good thing. So with this knowledge, we wanted to go and do iteration 3. I can go on silent. Let's turn that off. So we built a very quick index screen. I think this took me about 20 minutes. We're still dealing with the same framework. We're still otherwise dealing with the same models. But you can see now we at least have a list of all of the contacts. Again, if you're dealing with real data, you'd actually see 20 different contacts that have Alex and Aiden repeated over and over and over again. This doesn't look like much, but it was really important because it did validate to us that this whole index concept actually matters, and the most important thing isn't seeing an individual contact, it's being able to see them all. Because it's actually only 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 that we actually cared about. The rest, like emails, we just wanted to delete immediately, never see again. And in fact, this started to become more and more like email in that respect. So with that knowledge, we wanted to make that index look a little bit better. And just to make sure everybody's following, it's interesting how this evolved, because it went from an idea with a very shitty implementation to just by messing around with technology and poking things with a stick, it started to turn out pretty damn good, and it started to become usable. So we wanted to start making that index better. We're also at a point now where everything in the prototype works. You know, iteration 1, iteration 2, it works as a proof of concept, it works to show people. But if you use it for more than 5 minutes, there's every chance the thing will melt and break. You know, if you try and do something funny, like press the same button 4 times, there's every chance that it would just break or actually do the action 4 times, neither of which we want. So by iteration 4, we're finally at a point where this isn't happening because we've just caught the bugs as we're going. Interestingly, what we realized is that with that index view, has anybody who used Mailbox or the new Gmail inbox before? Sweet. So what we really liked were these swipe actions. You'd start swiping a card, it would follow your finger. You'd swipe it left, it would follow your finger, and these were actually actions. Turns out that was a really good idea and something that we thought we should implement. We also wanted to pay back some technical debt. Important in prototypes is when you don't know what you're building, don't pay back any technical debt, just do it as dirty and quickly as you possibly can. As you're starting to get closer and closer to being greenlit, try not to have 30 days of technical debt by the time you're done. So we did 2 things. We did the bounce scroll that I think everybody who's ever used a phone is familiar with. Very quick implementation. We actually use Iter scroll, which is great when you're building mobile apps with some front-end framework. The other thing we did was we implemented list view. Has anybody here heard of list view or iOS's collection view before? So basically what this does is, you could imagine that we have hundreds of contacts in memory, right? We're loading 200 at a time, 300 at a time. It's not really performant to have 300 of those on the screen, even though the user can only see 4 of them or 5 of them at any given time. You don't want them all to be higher and lower and just scroll into position. What you really want to do is only actually have 5 DOM elements on the screen and just change them as a user scrolls, so it's much more performant. It's interesting that very few people do this. If you're using Ember, just use Ember List View, you get that out of the box and it's completely free. The other thing we did, by the way, is just cut a release. Didn't look pretty yet, you're about to see it, but it was enough for us to actually go around and really show people a working version that did what we needed it to do. So that's what that new index looked like. You can probably tell that we completely screwed the pooch in our CSS spacing and just didn't care and never went backwards. Again, that's not what we were trying to do, and you have to be so brutally focused on the thing you're actually trying to do and nothing else. So you can see there were actually photos here. It's only because I was rolling back code that's a little bit older. We've since changed the endpoint where images came from, so you don't see images here. But just to show you how it worked, and you see it's not pretty yet, but we can drag the card left, we can drag the card right, we drag the card over a threshold, the card disappears. Again, not animated perfectly yet, but we've realized that, okay, we can do this, it works. Just to give you an idea, swiping left, or this way, actually means that you're deleting the contact. You're saying, I don't want you to show up in my list ever again. This was really important, right? Because not every contact matters and you want to just dismiss some people. When you're swiping this way, it just means totally up and again in 30 days, please. So we found a lot of people, it just wasn't pertinent yet, and as much as we could have a screen saying, remind me in March or remind me in February, you really want that shortcut action of just not now. Don't delete them, just not now. And that's what that meant. So, as I said, probably every designer in the room had a slight coronary seeing how that drag worked. It was really slow and not that pretty. That was fine, we were just trying to test the concept. Part of that's just we're working with the DOM, dropping on a phone. We're like in abstracted states. None of it's natural, none of it's really supposed to be here, but everybody does it anyway. So we needed to move to Canvas, and I think Aiden's here somewhere. So if you have Canvas questions, he's up the back, go and ask Aiden questions. Is anybody here familiar with Canvas? Sweet. So for the people who aren't, just think of Canvas as a much better way that we can render things on a screen that removes a lot of the problems with DOM. And DOM is basically HTML. The biggest restriction is that the DOM can only go so fast. And for those natural filling animations, you actually have to be faster than the DOM can go. This is why you've probably all used apps before where you could tell that it was a web app dropped in iOS, or you could tell that it was a web app dropped in Android. It just felt a little bit shitty, and no matter what people did, you could always just tell. It never fully reacted to your finger, the animation was always just a clip of a second too slow. Moving to Canvas solves that because we have a 16 millisecond target, which was Aiden's research. So conceptually, Unread was stable at this point, so it made sense to go and try and fix that animation. If it was a user login screen or a menu, we probably wouldn't have bothered, but again, this is the core of what we're building, this is what we're making, this is what we care about. So what Aiden did was he forked the repo, and then just tried to see, well, can he make a better slide action working in Canvas? So I think, yeah. So, much better. The thing is, we're still working within Ember. We actually made Canvas and Ember work together, so we didn't have to switch to React. But that's already feeling much more native. The bounces are maybe a little bit too quick, and the actions maybe a little bit too quick, but we saw what we needed to see, which is that the app's responding in a way that it would if we wrote it in Objective-C or if we wrote it in Java. By the way, we don't want to do that because when we write it this way, it will work on Android, it will work on iOS, one code base with about 1/10 of the lines. All of this is very, very good. So, I'm just going to go back so we don't get there. So sweet. Now we have that. Let's start making the app look better. This is when we're not in the design stage yet. We haven't even consulted with designers yet. Sometimes people ask us when should design get involved. It honestly depends on how much money you have. If you have a lot of money, get a designer involved very early. If you're trying to save it and you don't know what you're building, just wait until you at least get to this state when the designer at least knows what needs to be on the screen. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a cluster. So we started adding some paint. Right? Not perfect. We actually just used the UI kit that we really liked. Mocked what that new add account screen looks like. All of these screens are live on the app. Fix the login screen. We'll probably change it from login, please. Change the way that index works and change the way that actual show card works. Which, by the way, we're at maybe 2 weeks of programming time at this point, probably a lot less. And going from these screens, we consider what it looked like in the first iteration, big difference. It now looks like an app, now feels like an app, and importantly, it's being battle tested. We were actually using it every day. We really liked it. So we started adding that paint. I should have considered that I need to go backwards and forwards a lot. So after 6 iterations, not a lot left, right? All we need to really do is, actually maybe find a designer who knows what they're doing, because none of us do. Finish the app in buttons and just make them animate a little bit better when we click them, just give a little bit more feedback. Again, these are all things that we could have done early, but aren't what we wanted to be done. Productionize the backend. This is what we were talking about with fixtures earlier, that the couple of models that are still mocked, now we're just going to make them real. We already have sessions. We just need to go and drop a Rails endpoint, define a couple of extra models, and we're good. And like I said, they're active designer. So, just to do a quick summary, how am I going for time? Right. We very honestly believe that if you build a much better product by forcing evolution. So, if you keep doing very, very small iterations, very, very easy to understand. Everybody gets it. Everybody has good ideas. It's just so much better than being given a bunch of 10-page documents that I then send back, asking questions. They send back more documents. We honestly still have people who prefer building this way today. That's probably most of the enterprise world still. So much easier for us, and we actually got a much better product out the other side. What's interesting is that that's probably understating most of our initial assumptions, were completely wrong. Right? That Tinder was a really bad idea, but we thought it was a really good idea at the start. If we were sitting in Balsamiq, we would have made that look so beautiful in Balsamiq, and we would have still had the wrong idea. So you want to expose that as quickly as you can. Part of that's also just being willing to work in a team where you're able to say, look, we completely fucked up again, let's just start from zero. That's a good thing. As long as you're focusing on very, very small iterations in a couple of days, you actually haven't lost much time yet. You've lost a hell of a lot less than what will happen when by day 9 you decide you want to change everything and your developer has to do a really severe rollback. Much better to discover that today. So another thing is a lot of technology hurdles that we would have maybe not anticipated, we actually discovered just by messing around, poking with a stick and using live data. Two best ones I can give you is the multi-email scenarios. The fact that as I was using the app, I realized that I didn't just want to connect this to one email account, I wanted to connect it to all of my email accounts, because that's kind of a global thing. The other hurdle we discovered is that Gmail passing, you're actually only allowed 5 concurrent threads to a Gmail account. And that's not per API or per user, that's globally. So if you have your iPhone open, you're probably already using 2 of those threads. If you also have an iPad on right now, you're using one of those threads. So you actually basically have to start monitoring when threads were available for us to plug into to download somebody's IMAP emails. So that was a very interesting challenge that if we discovered by day 90, really, really scary. By the time we had something that even looked vaguely okay, we'd already completely solved that problem and knew what we were getting into. Interestingly, you already saw that we gradually built more performant technology. So again, that swipe, we could have gone and got that swipe perfect the first time. It probably would have masked the fact that we were doing the wrong thing. So becoming gradually more performant just means you're not doing things right until they're actually right. So that's it for this talk. I hope that was what everybody expected. Again, if you're sitting here as I'm speaking thinking, God, I want these people to build my apps for me, that's where you can find me. Otherwise, any questions? Yes? Sorry, what was that? When do we stop paying for the technical debt? So a little bit in every iteration, right? So within the case of this one, iteration 2, we paid a little bit by going and plugging into real email accounts, even though you didn't see that in today's data. Again, privacy. By iteration 3, we added user accounts, which we would have never done in number 1. By number 5, we've gone and fixed up things like scrollers. We'd actually made sure everything was firmly in a component and that the actual code base was clean. So it's more about looking at what state we're in and admitting whether we think the app is good enough yet. Not good enough from a beauty point of view, but from a functional point of view. Then we'll pay back a little bit of debt because we did a good job. If we did a bad job and it's no closer, no debt gets paid back until we're on the right path again. That helps. Anybody else? Yeah, right off the back first. Yeah, is Aiden here? Do you want to explain? Can you expand on the 16 milliseconds? So if you're not a programmer, just pretend that didn't happen. Otherwise, hopefully that helps. Sweet. I think you had one as well.
So what are your thoughts regarding, say, using something like Firebase or Spark for kind of prototyping?
Yep. So I have nothing against Firebase or Parse. It's not something I've used as much. But in this project, there were two reasons that we didn't use it. The first one was we always start by just stubbing the data locally, because as much as that might work out of the box, we just don't want to even deal with that, don't want to consider it. Right? I kind of consider that we just have so many chips to spend, and those chips are technology risk. So every time we introduce a new tech, something else is going to go wrong. We just want to limit that and focus on what we're building. The other reason was, in this case, we kind of already had some stuff we could recycle from stuff we've built before, so we cheated a little bit there. The other reason we really like fixtures, though, is because it's stub data. It means that I can go in and actually execute a delete action and pretend I'm deleting something. When I close the app and open it again, I'm straight back in that initial state. And that's really, really handy when you don't know what you're building yet, because you forget, was that a bug that knocked that user, or was it me pressing delete that knocked that user? So the more you can keep a very consistent state, the easier it is just to mess around with things. Once we become more formal and are actually, hey, we're building the API, that's when we use something like that. Any other questions? Up the back? Did you say compared to the Angular or Ionic? So I've not used Ionic as much. Is that the UI toolkit? So yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. To be very, very open, we didn't use any UI toolkits in this, in part because we intentionally wanted to keep it shitty until we knew what we were doing. Again, it's too easy to think we built something beautiful and trick ourselves in the fact that we actually built something well, which are very, very different things. And then by the time we actually just got to production, we realized that we didn't need that yet. That may change, but otherwise I'm both not much of a UI toolkit type of person, and to be honest, I usually skip as much of the front end apart from the core Ember as I can, so probably not the right person to talk about which is best. I think we use Bourbon and Neat only because I think that grid system is one of the easier ones to figure out. Any other questions? Sweet, thank you.